Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. Kennedy Library education and public programs on civil rights and social justice are also supported in part by AT&T. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. As we continue to process yesterday's guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd, and as Black and Brown people in this country continue to be disproportionately harmed by law enforcement, I'm especially grateful to have this timely opportunity to explore current issues in police and justice reform with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm so pleased to extend a warm virtual welcome back to the library to Reginald Dwayne Betts. An award-winning poet, memoirist, and teacher, he is the author of 3 acclaimed collections of poetry, as well as A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison. He often speaks about his own experiences, detailing his trek from incarceration to Yale Law School, and the role that grit, perseverance, and literature played in his success, as well as his work in public defense and years of advocacy for the reform of the criminal justice system. He has received a National Magazine Award and Guggenheim and NEA fellowships. He was appointed by President Obama to the Coordinating Council of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and by Governor Ned Lamont to the Criminal Justice Commission, the state body responsible for hiring prosecutors in Connecticut. I'm also delighted to welcome Tracie Keesee to the library. Dr. Keesee is the co-founder and senior vice president of justice initiatives of the Center for Policing Equity, which promotes police transparency and accountability by facilitating innovative research collaborations between law enforcement agencies and empirical social scientists, and seeks to improve issues of equity both within law enforcement agencies and between the communities they serve. She has served as the first ever Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion for the New York Police Department, and she is a retired 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department. Dr. Keesee has published numerous articles across a variety of collected anthologies and peer-reviewed scientific journals. We're also grateful to be joined by Khalil Muhammad. Dr. Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. His scholarship examines the broad intersections of race, democracy, inequality, and criminal justice in modern US history. An award-winning author and teacher, his work has been featured in numerous national print and broadcast media outlets. I'm also delighted to welcome Chuck Wexler to our virtual stage. Dr. Wexler is Executive Director of the Police Executive Research Forum, an organization of law enforcement officials and others dedicated to improving the professionalism of policing. A native of Boston, he held a number of key positions in the Boston Police Department, including as operations assistant to the police commissioner when he played a central role in the agency's efforts to prevent violence in the wake of court-ordered desegregation of the Boston school system. He also served as an assistant to the nation's first director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And joining us as our moderator this evening is Errin Haines, who I'm pleased to welcome to this discussion. She is editor-at-large at the 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. An award-winning journalist with nearly 2 decades of experience, she was previously national writer on race for the Associated Press. She's also worked at the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. Please join me in welcoming our special guests. Over to you, Errin.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you so much to the Kennedy Library for this conversation, which is obviously very urgent and particularly timely, given where we are. I mean, it was just over 24 hours ago that we were all just kind of processing the Derek Chauvin verdict and what it meant not only for the family of George Floyd, but also for our nation at large. And so I think I just want to open this conversation by checking in with everybody. I mean, how are you and where are you on the other side of the verdict? And what are your thoughts here as Derek Chauvin sits in a jail cell and we ponder kind of where we go from here? I will start with you, Tracie.
Well, thank you, Errin. And again, thank you for the invitation from the Kennedy Library. Where I am right now is I'm exhausted. I'm also a little concerned. I'm still processing. I'm hoping that folks don't think that what happened yesterday is the end of what needs to continue. And so I'm just sort of sitting with that for a little bit. But I would tell you I'm exhausted. I'm tired. And I can tell you that I can also not watch another video. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah. Khalil, what about you?
Well, I'm feeling that the Floyd family got the accountability that they deserve with the 3 guilty convictions. I've been listening to Philonese's remarks yesterday at the press conference and feeling very inspired by his sense of closure, but also his commitment to justice. And this refrain from him that justice for Floyd is freedom for all. Too often these conversations center around experts of one kind or another having these discussions. And I feel like in this particular moment, as has been true with various moms who've lost their sons in these cases, but in this moment, it feels because of the scale of this circumstance that we need them to have this moment. I have plenty to say about my own cautious optimism about what comes next, but that's how I'm feeling.
Yeah. Dwayne, what about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I guess I'm afraid, I think we think about the not guilty verdicts and we never say that the not guilty verdicts was a product of 12 American citizens that decided that what they saw on camera wasn't what we saw on camera. And then we think about the guilty verdict and we say that this is some modicum of justice. And then in my head, I think about mass incarceration, and I wonder what I'll say to people who say that the life sentence my homie got after the jury found him guilty was justice. And it's a way in which I'm supposed to disentangle what I believe about mass incarceration in general and how the system is bankrupt in general from how I might feel that Chauvin deserves to do a bid in particular, right? But he gonna do less time than I did in prison. And I stole $10 from somebody. So how do I feel? I feel like I'm in the center of a kind of masquerade ball in which, we are joyous until we find blood in the punch.
Yeah. Yeah. And Chuck, what about you? Where are you with all of this?
Well, I think it's, you just listen to people talk and everyone's perspective is important, and where you are in life and how you view this is different. For me, I can remember the Rodney King verdict, which was 30 years ago, and how the country was focused on that moment. Maybe not so much as this moment, but nevertheless, their outcome of that case with a jury deciding that those officers were not guilty resulted in 53 people dying, $2 billion worth of damage. And there was not consensus about that case the way there was about this case. So I begin with the sympathies to the Floyd family, number one, but the recognition that I think, and maybe, I'm overstating this, that the community and at least the police chiefs that I know of were on the same page in terms of the outcome. I mean, I don't know how our country would have done, even with a mistrial, never mind not guilty. But if one juror had said, you know what, I'm not sure that officer committed murder. I think maybe he, if that judge had read, we have a mistrial, I think that would have been catastrophic. So I think from my perspective, the people I've talked to and I respect were relieved that, at least in terms of justice, if you will, that 12 people saw it the same and that it will have an impact on people's lives differently. But that going back to Rodney King, that 30-year period, I'd like to say that we've at least come farther, maybe not far enough, but perspective-wise, that's how I see it differently.
Yeah, the Rodney King verdict was actually on a lot of people's minds. I think also because, April 29th is the 30th anniversary of that verdict. And so that is what people, no, wait, 29. I'm not a math, journalists don't do math so well, but April 29th.
It's about 30. It's about 30.
April 29th is the anniversary of that verdict. And so, and honestly, I mean, certainly the Derek Chauvin case felt like the highest profile case to my mind, even though obviously Rodney King was not killed. Certainly it felt that high profile, on television, wall to wall, every single day. And the stakes certainly felt very familiar. I'm based in Philadelphia and our downtown was certainly boarded up in anticipation.
Right.
Of the type of outcome that you were just alluding to, but I want to talk about something else that was definitely different in this era, and certainly very different from the last 4 years, and that was that you had the president and vice president very quickly after the verdict coming out and addressing the nation, speaking to this verdict and calling for police reform to happen in this country. And I wonder, because that was something that had been absent really from the national conversation in terms of national leadership. I'm wondering what all of you think about whether it mattered that was a moment that the country had also in the midst of all of this. Certainly Joe Biden, somebody who had said during the campaign, just challenging the country in terms of the idea of this not being who we are. Well, I think we, have seen with the unrelenting killing of Black people that this is who we are, but are we going to make a different choice now? Hearing from the president and vice president, do you all think that was important? Do you think that impacts kind of where we go from here? I will start with you, Dwayne.
Yeah, I think it was important partly because he noted that the verdict was much too rare. I mean, I think the reality is that, I don't know, we expect the justice system to do one thing really, really well, and it does it amazingly well when it's Black folks and brown folks who have committed crimes, and it's put them in prison. And it's so funny that now put people in prison is called accountability. That's not, that's not accountability. And I think it's really dangerous to say that, because I think the folks who are saying that, even when the president says that and others are saying that, are trying to lend a credence to the justice system that it hasn't earned, right? But I think what's important about him noting that it's all too rare is to make us remember that the rareness is a product of police not being held accountable, even in the face of video evidence. This was so pervasive that I don't think anybody in the country could run away from the reality of what happened. And so I think the president noting that, I just think it's jurors who find people not guilty. And we never really talk about, it's not the failure of imagination of prosecutors, it's the failure of imagination of the American citizens that sit on juries. And I think him saying that this is not frequent enough It's to note that we as American citizens have all too often, like we say we should have more jury trials. And we always have jury trials with the police because we always absolve the police. And I think this is a moment of saying that 12 citizens looked at this and said, nah, this is not okay. And yes, it took us 591 more minutes than it took him to kill George Floyd. But in those 591 minutes, we decided that he was guilty of all 3 accounts.
Yeah, you're making such a good point there, Dwayne. And I think that is also why it's important to see some of the polling that we have seen in recent years, since at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, you had folks who basically thought that this was, an idea that many Americans were opposed to, they were afraid of, they were, they felt was radical. And yet, you get to last summer, by the time George Floyd is killed and you have a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-gendered coalition of folks in the streets in a sustained, protest around the idea that Black Lives Matter, right? And many of those people, any one of them, could be potential jurors in one of these cases in cities across the country. And so, it does matter that public sentiment around the idea that Black Lives Matter and calls for police reform, it seems to be evolving, and where the ways in which those people show up as part of, to your point, our legal system, certainly is something to think about. So you make a really good point there. I think also, the other thing that we saw coming out of yesterday was the calls for action around the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which is in Congress, which has stalled out in an evenly divided, very hyper-partisan Senate, and you had a lot of Black lawmakers, but also the Speaker and Majority Leader saying this needs to happen. The President and Vice President saying that this legislation needs to pass. I am wondering if Chuck, if you see the emotion and momentum, I think, that came out of yesterday's verdict, do you see that potentially translating, at a legislative level, at a federal legislative level, or do you think that this is something that, frankly, could get hijacked by the culture wars that are happening in our hyper-partisan government?
Let me, before I answer that, I would just like to say something to Dwayne about what he just said, and then come back to your point if I could. I think Dwayne made such an important point there that really gets lost on people, that those 12 jurors in Minneapolis, or those, I guess it's 12 jurors in Los Angeles, really held the fate of the criminal justice system in their hands. And so when people say, why don't we prosecute more police officers? I think a lot of that thinking is a prosecutor thinking, will I get 12 people to agree on this? I look at the George Floyd case, the Chauvin case, as an open and shut case, no ambiguity, right? But so many of these other cases, you can have one person on that jury that doesn't quite, I think the police officer, he made some mistakes, but I don't think he committed a crime, right? That could be their thinking. But I think the point Dwayne made is huge, because if the issue is having accountability, how do you have accountability? And this is the great thing. It's both a blessing and a curse. The criminal justice system says you should be tried by 12 people, 12 peers. But what happens if one of those peers isn't necessarily a peer of yours?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, can you imagine if that case had to be tried again, the psychological impact on the country because one person somehow held out? So I just wanted to underscore what Dwayne said, because I think that's huge. And going back to your point, Errin, how do you talk about federal legislation? It's going to be hard. But even so, I really believe so much of this is about culture, is about values, is about character, about hiring, recruitment, all of that. And I don't believe you can legislate that. People talk about qualified immunity. Oh, if we can just solve the qualified immunity issue. I mean, we could talk till we're blue as to whether, but how do you get a police officer to do what's humane? How do you get a police officer to back away from a situation that's not going well? How do we prevent the next incident? So much of our thinking is on the back end. What are we going to do to hold police officers accountable? Well, what could we have done to save George Floyd's life? We should be thinking about that too. Why are police making a big deal out of $20 counterfeit money when they could just say, hey, look, you know what? We know who he is. It's okay. We'll get you some other time. This isn't worth, arresting him and fighting and when over $20. Where's the proportionality? I just think, Errin, my point to your question is simply, we need to be careful that we don't think that this is about legislative fixes, because I don't think you can legislate culture, character, honesty, hiring, integrity.
Yeah, Chuck, I certainly take your point. Legislating hearts and minds is that's not really how it works. But I guess in the absence of changing hearts and minds, how do you make somebody follow the rules? And that piece of legislation obviously is not. I mean, even Vice President Harris said last night, this is not going to be a panacea, right? Like there are multi-pronged strategies to addressing the issue of policing and criminal justice reform, from protests to Congress, state houses, local governments, and and the Justice Department. Tracie, I want to come to you on that because we saw Attorney General Merrick Garland today saying that they are going to open a pattern and practice investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. Pattern and practice investigations, as we know, have been absent in the last 4 years, as former Vice President Mike Pence jettisoned pattern and practice investigations, said they were not needed, said, basically we're not going to be, enforcing, making this consent decrees for folks. The return of pattern and practice investigations and possibly consent decrees for some of these jurisdictions. Talk about what that means and why it matters in your opinion.
Well, what it means is that you have someone who can step in and really go through an organization and begin to understand what is happening there. It's creating the types of outcomes that you've seen in Minneapolis PD and other places. But it's also a legal way to say, okay, without going to court, let's walk you through some of the things you should be doing, you should be changing, the policies you should be looking at. How are you holding your officers accountable? So it's a good tool, but I got to raise a flag because this came up. I know the president made this announcement and, the pattern and practice, and we forget that Minneapolis had already been under a DOJ consent decree. They had already had this particular process. And so I think what it speaks to is that this is beyond policies and procedures and legislation. You really need to understand, and Chuck sort of mentioned this, the culture of policing is problematic, period. And as much work as we think we can do, you have to go after the culture. And you start doing that by really defining what is the role, not only of police, but what's the role of public safety? And what does that mean by community standards? And what should it look like? And how does that define the type of person you will have in policing? Like, so what do we want? Because one of the things that we're hearing, usually in pattern and practice that will come out, they will review use of force. They will make sure that, the hiring practices, that the department's definitely, hopefully representing the diversity of the community. And so there's lots of things that are put in that mix. But what I get concerned about is that we're going back to some same old tools that had moderate outcomes. And the community does not have the patience for it. And nor are they willing to wait and see. And so while that might be, good for organizations some are proactively asking for it, it may be good for Minneapolis that we'll wait and see. But what the community is asking is for beyond that. We need you to get on the ground. You need to work with us collaboratively. You need to hear us. You need to center our needs and begin to figure out from there, where do you go? And so, again, I think any tools we can bring are going to be nice. You're going to have some agencies, and you still to this day, that think this is a horrible idea and decision. I think one of the things, as we were talking about, the president and the vice president acknowledging the verdict, what we weren't talking about is how that was being sort of accepted or not accepted by police, by the officers on the ground. And the conversations that we're having with police officers, I can tell you this is not the justice system that most white officers would think is being fair. There were plenty of them that thought that this was a mistrial, that there's no way to get a fair trial. And I found that to be very interesting when we're talking about officers and we're talking about white men. It's perfectly fine when you bring somebody else. And I don't want us to forget that it wasn't too long ago in Minneapolis that they prosecuted a Black police officer.
Yes.
And so, again, it's the tools are great. There's no patience from community to repeat tools that only have moderate types of outcomes, that there's got to be more than just that. So glad to hear it. I'm going to wait and see if they're going to be bringing more than just policy reviews and things that help sort of do what we've done historically.
Yeah, I mean, Tracie, you're making such an important point about, and something that Chuck kind of alluded to as well. The idea that you can't legislate hearts and minds, and yet the culture of policing is something that needs to change, and it needs to change really among the rank and file, right? I mean, in the closing arguments of the Derek Chauvin trial, you had, prosecutors saying Derek Chauvin was not acting, in the best way that a police officer is supposed to act, and asking what a reasonable officer would have done in that situation, right? So really trying to distance him from what is good policing and what the majority of police officers are doing. And so, I wonder, for those white officers that you talk about who, saw this as a mistrial, who are feeling very demoralized by the conversation around the need to improve policing and make it equitable for all, how do you reach those officers? Are they reachable?
I think some are reachable. And I want to go back a little bit, though, because it's not that the officer said he did not act in the way in which our values and culture will really stand up, depending on who you are. But the fact that no one intervened means for me that you are just equally as culpable. And the fact that we don't have a culture of that intervention, which is now starting to come online, we don't have a long history of people intervening. And when we do, they typically are sort of pushed out. They are demonized. They're transferred out. This is the case in St. Louis County, where someone had stepped up years ago to prevent her partner from choking someone, and goes through all of this emotion because she tried to do the right thing. So I think what we talk about, how come officers on the ground still are very divided in regards to what is happening today, is because we don't really talk to cops. I think the work that Chuck does with the chiefs and mid and small departments is incredible, but often missing is the voice of the street cop, the one that has to go through whatever is happening outside. And that includes specifically officers of color and women. You will find that officers of color and women are struggling inside organizations who may think that they are progressive, but yet still are feeling the same types of equity issues internally that are happening when they're not in uniform on the street. So, as much as I would like to think that, the tools of, collaborative reform and all those things will really get some movement, we have to do much, much more than that. Much, much more than that.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask about doing more and about, while Derek Chauvin's case, in that courtroom was certainly about the decision that those 12 jurors had to make. To Chuck's point, what they, the decision that they were making did reverberate around the country, around the world. And it was part of this larger conversation, right? Even as it was also about justice for one family and one victim. Khalil, I want to come to you and ask you, kind of what your thoughts are around, because a lot of times when for people who see this as a sign of progress, right? Or who would point to the Derek Chauvin verdict and say, that was taken care of, what else do we need to do? Or shouldn't people be satisfied with the, with the system working, so to speak. Are you concerned that this one, guilty verdict could have a chilling effect on the momentum that we are now seeing, or that we started to see last summer, around the need for police reform in this country?
I'm actually less concerned about a chilling effect coming out of this verdict and then the 74 million Americans that voted for Donald Trump and then essentially gave license to a coup d'etat, an insurrection on the Capitol. That to me is more frightening, because it means that in every way, at the center of this issue of policing and the need for reform, we're sort of missing the broader context. I mean, spare me a few minutes to kind of make a historical arc, which is to say that if our nation was founded as a slave republic, of which some form of local militia or slave patrols did the work of creating the raw materials of wealth creation and ultimately the basis of this democracy to allow America to become a superpower by the 20th century, then the relationship of policing and the white men who are overrepresented in policing are still front and center in a conversation about whose democracy is this in the first place. And the degree to which the evidence just keeps pouring out of the role of various members as individuals of law enforcement who participated in the insurrection, and those who have supported a person who was facing murder charges for killing 2 people in a Black Lives Matter protest, Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, I'm more concerned about that than I am the racial fatigue that may come as a result of the Derek Chauvin verdict. I'm also concerned that, as much as I applaud Keith Ellison, I know him personally, I admire him as an elected official, and the work of that prosecutorial team, partly what happened in that trial was the performance of a legal team expressing the collective will of a white American public that essentially said, we're on trial. Policing's not on trial, we're on trial. Because if we can't get this, then everything that those activists are saying in the streets, all the property that will be the target as symbolic representations of the exploitation and the divestment in our communities, as Kimberly Jones so well articulated last summer when she said Black people don't own anything and can't burn down their own communities. It's hard for me not to see this trial as a way of affirmation that white people were affirmed by this more than anything else. Because when Eric Nelson played to every racist trope in the book and tethered each one of those Black people as superhuman, Black people as threatening, high crime areas, and tethered it directly to the actual section and code of the Minneapolis Police Department's policies, I'm looking at this and saying, we've had the prosecution who's doing a kind of a performance, a really good one, and we have the defense attorney literally following the playbook. And so my concern is the playbook more than anything else. My concern is the Hennepin County prosecutor going to lead an effort along with activists to rewrite the playbook? Because if it only stops with having performed in this excellent and outstanding way during the midst of this trial, then I've got 2 problems: the existing problem of white supremacy and white nationalism writ large, and the failure of this community of moderates and liberals who came together to seek the justice that the Chauvin or that George Floyd deserved, but is not willing to say, we all heard that playbook, and that playbook basically allows for just about anything.
Right.
And it's that discretion that Dwayne has described in these 12 jurors that hangs in the balance at the end of the day for whether Black people get to live or die.
Right. And just the idea, it's exactly to your point, that those jurors could see Derek Chauvin as doing something wrong, but still not necessarily agree with the idea that that systemic reform is needed, because there were a modicum of white people who did the right thing in this case. And so, doesn't that say something good about the country and the idea that this is not who we are, right? Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to talk about, I believe, Tracie, it was you that raised kind of this point, the idea around equity in policing. And the last time that you and I spoke, it was actually last summer when the reckoning was happening and you saw, these protesters in the street. Congresswoman Cori Bush spoke after the verdict yesterday and was saying, basically, we want the same treatment that everybody else gets. It's not that we want special treatment, it's that we want the same treatment as everyone else. I think that feels like an idea that has gotten kind of lost in especially in the culture war, where in the conversations around law and order versus defunding the police and all of these, kinds of things that feel like a distraction from the actual issue, right? I mean, what we are talking about is equitable policing, but for people who don't understand the idea of equitable policing, can you just talk a little bit about that and what it is going to take for us to get there?
Well, I mean, when you talk about something being equitable, it's not only to the access, but the way that particular system treats you and sees you, right? So the biggest piece for me in this whole Chauvin trial is the fact that that was a Black man that was not treated as a human being. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that, though. It's also whether or not a system is capable in producing equity. And right now, what we're seeing is we look at through all the departments and all the data that we're doing, we still see the disparities in traffic stops, excessive uses of force, and those types of things. And so one of the things when we talk about equity, we want to talk about not just your access to a system, but a system that just provides the things that need to keep you moving and treats you fairly, that you're not under any particular rules. And I'll go back to in my policing years when we talked about the war on drugs. We talked about the disparities in the way those types of sentences were given out. And yet here we are. And we talk about now we have a drug abuse problem in a predominantly white community, and we're arming ourselves with a remedy. The other remedy that we had for Black folks was prison and death. And so when we have these conversations with community, when we have these conversations with police departments as well, it's really, do you understand that the system, the way it was created, was not really created to be equitable, because it was not created to provide that equity to Black and brown people. So that's where you get a lot of the structural pieces. But along with the conversations we're having is whether or not you can do anything in this current state to fix it. That's where you're getting a lot of the pushback in the conversation. Are there things you can do to make this where, I guess, a system where Black and brown folks will always believe it's fair, or that they will have a fair shot? And we've seen this through different outcomes throughout the different countries, and well, I should say not countries, different cities, but even generationally, even myself on the street, the way we approach a neighborhood, the way we identified a neighborhood, we heard it, high crime, the remedies we provided were having outcomes that were always disparate. And that's because of the system in which we're operating was not created equally. So really, we have to begin to figure out what things do we need to do? What do you start to do that begins to reduce some of that? And again, this is not harm reductive work that you would see traditionally, but what things you put in place? This is some of the reimagining work that you're hearing. But reimagining work is not meant to be a final product. The reimagining work that folks are talking about, that we've been involved in, really talks about a brand new system that works very differently and also has an understanding of what the role, is there a role for policing, and what does public safety mean? Mm-hmm. And so it's very different depending on the generation that you're talking to. I know I can talk to my mother about this, and she's not seeing a problem at all. And I can talk to folks on the ground who say, no, this is never going to be fixed. This is never going to work. And we need to start over. So it's really sort of multifaceted, Errin, but it's one of those things now when we talk about equity, how are we defining equity? What does that look like? And what does it feel like? And that's a question too often has been left to law enforcement to answer and not for community to answer.
Well, Dwayne, I see you about to jump out of your Zoom screen over there on me. I feel like you have some thoughts on this. And so I want to come to you next to tell me what that's about.
No, I was just trying to get into Quantico. And it struck me that, Tracie's been to Quantico. And I was wondering, how do I get a gig like that? Like, how do I get trained at Quantico? And and I'm being tongue in cheek, but it reminded me that like,
Dwayne, are you talking about the FBI Academy?
yeah, I'm talking about the FBI Academy. Because
Why
like,
do you want to go to the FBI Academy?
for two reasons. First, we talk about policing, and the truth is like I always think about policing as separate from the community. And so in all of these conversations, the police that stood by and watched Chauvin do what he did, the incident where the woman where the police officer prevented her peer from choking somebody out and spent, I think, a decade because they took her pension, they took her job. She had to go to the up to the Circuit Court of Appeals to win. You know, she lost several times. I feel like that system that we're talking about reforming is a system that doesn't just operate under a veil of darkness, right? It's a system that operates with a price of admission. That means people like me will never be involved. People in my community will never be involved. And the price of the ticket, what it means to become a police officer, is to like be like inculcated, indoctrinated, introduced into a secret society. What would it mean if 20% of police officers were civilians who could only work for 5 years? Because ultimately, those police officers who watched Chauvin, and let's be real, he might have been putting his neck on brothers' throats for decades. So they might have realistically not expected George Floyd to die. And those officers, the decision that they were making in that moment was, do I stand quiet in the face of a ordinary injustice? Because he does this all the time. For a peer that I will work with for decades, or do I risk my job? And the only reason that that's a question that they have to answer is because I'll never be invited to Quantico. In fact, I won't even get a job in most places in this country. You know, we act as if, you know, it'd be great if the police hadn't done that to George Floyd and he had been able to live. But we also understand that one of the conditions that prevent somebody like Mr. Floyd from getting the job, that allow the police to accuse him of possibly having a counterfeit 20s, because when they lock him up and they run his records, they try to arrest him, they run his records, they say, oh, he's a convicted felon. Of course he's guilty. And so my thing is like, how do we create a system in which is far more porous than it is now? And so ex-police officers aren't people who have gotten exhausted with the inhumanity, but maybe ex-officers are people who like, you did your 3, you did your 5. And so when we go to this jury, we got 2, 3, 4, 6, 10, 12% of the population who witnessed everything that was going on and can hold officers in check. Nobody, you know, I feel like officers don't tell me the truth about not how they look at me. Because I had a pistol, I robbed somebody. I don't get murdered by the police. You are more likely to get murdered by the police if you get picked up for a traffic ticket. That's why I got a sign in my car that says baby on board and puppy on board. Because I know the police will see those signs and think initially, this is a white man or this is a black man driving a car of a white man. I'm going to treat him with some care and some respect. And we don't admit that. And we don't think about what the system would look like if it was porous enough that Chauvin wasn't held account when he murdered somebody, but he was held in account 6 years ago when he first strangled somebody, or 3 years ago when literally, Richard Wright wrote a novel in 1940s about police officers beating a confession out of a man, and publishers refused to publish it. And then just 2 weeks ago, somebody got out of prison in New York after 20 years because police officers beat a confession out of him. Like, we live in a society that in some ways refuses to confront the evidence that exists before us, and also refuses to take steps to make the evidence more public.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, folks.
So plus one. Plus one on what Dwayne is saying. And let me be clear about the experience of the Black officer is, and I'm assuming, I don't know how many you've had conversations with, is always pretty straightforward, that the decisions they have to make to navigate that space, to stay and feed families or try to figure out and do something different, is always at play. So I appreciate you lifting that up.
Yeah.
And Errin, I want to jump in on this too, just for a second. So I want to tell a story and just a quick fact. The millions of dollars that get paid out in either wrongful death or brutality suits tells us, and this is just to extend Dwayne's argument, tells us that not only is our population unwilling to demand a different kind of policing in the face of the facts and evidence, because I don't believe police officers can reform themselves. This is like asking the fossil fuel industry to get rid of its addiction to the money that it makes in the fossil fuel game. So they're not going to do it on their own. But the public is also seemingly unwilling. They are willing to pay millions of dollars year after year through, of course, the municipal budget as well as the insurance premiums that go along with it, in the face of the evidence, right? Because there's an admission, even if it's not formal, that something went wrong. Now, to the point of, and I'm really prompting Chuck here because I think we need as much clarity as possible in moments like this. So I've been in a lot of conversations with police chiefs over the years, and most of them reform police chiefs. And you hear it time and time again, essentially that the chiefs are on board. I've been in a room with Bratton around a bunch of community leaders. I've been with Cy Vance. I've had all these conversations, and there's like an ocean of difference between the articulations of police chiefs and the top brass about equity, about justice, about the policy, about what they're doing, about historical reckoning, and the rank and file in too many instances. And so here's the quick story. So I'm in Alabama. Chuck Ramsey is sitting next to me. Serpa is around the corner from him. A bunch of other folks are in the room. And one of the chiefs gets a call from one of his rank and file members after he has just mentioned that he visited by either text or social media, that he had visited Bryan Stevenson's National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And for our viewers, this is the First Nations lynching museum to memorialize the victims of domestic racial terror. Okay. And this rank and file member writes back to the chief and says, "How dare you disrespect us by being part of this conversation?" So like, if we can't be honest about the huge reservoir of racism that lives within policing, and we just get drips and drabs of the evidence and the acceptance of a public that chooses to be in willful denial about this, because these stories are too old and too frequent for them not to say, like if this were my kid, if these were my kids, that I couldn't actually call the police in the event that I might care about them, because if they show up, they might kill my 19-year-old kid in the home that the burglar is trying to get into. Like, that's the reality for Black folks. Like, I can't call the police because someone's breaking in my house, but they might shoot my own son. All right, I'm done. I'm off my horse.
Well, so Khalil, threw it to you, Chuck, and I'm going to come to you because you were just on PBS NewsHour talking about this potentially being a defining moment for policing, and I want you to talk about what you meant by that, and how you see the potential way forward coming out of this moment.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways we could look at this. I mean, one is the conversation we're having now. I mean, I think I'm on record as opposed to transmit on this conversation because I'm listening and wanting to understand better my own perspectives versus what I'm hearing here. But I think the change in policing will come when police officers themselves recognize the importance of changing. And I think my friend who just spoke, talked about the Chuck Ramseys, the Bill Brattons, and so forth. So I think, and Tracie understands this too, because she knows those people, is at that level, they sort of get it, right? I mean, they get it. And I think the point you were making was, how do you get the rank and file to accept this? Here's where I think things may start to change. I think, and Tracie, maybe you and I don't agree on this, and so I would welcome your perspective. I think what's going to happen in policing is when you have a situation, a George Floyd situation like that, if you have a police chief giving permission and saying, I want you to intervene, do you understand that is a noble thing for you to do? And if you have to talk about it in terms of self-interest, what you're really saying is, not only are you going to do the right thing, but you're going to save a life, number one, sanctity of human life. And number two, you're going to save careers, right? If those, and those two officers who were with Chauvin, he's a 19-year veteran. Those two officers are rookie cops. Somehow those rookie cops, how do we get them a message from up high that says, even though you're rookie cops, you need to overcome this 19-year veteran because he's doing the wrong thing. So forget about all that chain of command right now and do step up and step in. Because those rookie cops, you know what they were saying to the 19-year veteran? Shouldn't we turn him on his side? I'm concerned about excited delirium. That's going to come out in the case that where they're tried. Their attorney's going to say, sir, officer, what did you say? I said to Officer Chauvin, turn him on his side. I'm worried about excited delirium. And a 19-year veteran just waved him off. So when you can get police officers to recognize that that change we're talking about has to come at their level, that's, I think, when we're going to see significant change. And here's the other question for you, the really tough one. Who do we want to be the police officers of the future? And what happens to those people who are looking at what's happening to policing and say, you know what, I got these opportunities over here and there and so forth. I don't need this. How are we going to attract the best and the brightest? How are we going to get them from communities that normally wouldn't want them? How are we going to do that? You know, I think that's something we should be thinking about. I'm not sure I addressed everybody's issues, but I hope at least I encouraged the discussion here. Tracie, do you want to take me on?
Of course I do. And you encouraged the discussion, and I'm going to go back to what Khalil was talking about, and that is the vast differences between leadership and rank and file. And what I agree with you is, of course, officers should be doing that type of intervention, but they're not, because we don't have a culture of it, and we don't have a sustained working knowledge of how that's going to work. What we have, and I think you know this, what we have is fear. What we have are officers who, if they step up, are going to be ostracized by their sorority and fraternity. They're going to be placed by their command staff in places they don't want to be, to show them a lesson in a way that's not going to be made public. And so even with the training, and I sit on that board, I think the training is important, but I think we cannot sort of credit that training because we don't have a history of it. We just don't. And we know about groupthink, and we know what happens when we close ranks. And those are the things that we're not talking about, right? So I hear you, Chuck, and that I'm not saying that, we should, but we don't, only because we don't have a long sustained history of it. And it's the same thing with officers in mental health. We've had an increase of suicides with officers. And the reason why that's showing up is because as much support as we were trying to give, there is still a stigma attached if you have a mental health issue or if you need some help. So it goes all the way back to, what we're willing to talk about. And we don't want to talk about that publicly because it doesn't fit with our narrative of who we are and who we think we are. And so that is the biggest issue right now, is the fact that you have line level, and again, this is not new, and it's not new to Chuck either, of folks who belong to white supremacist organizations who are in policing, who go all the way from the top to the bottom. We don't really know how deep. And so you have folks who do not want to see this change happen. And what you saw, and I think Khalil mentioned this, you had 73 million people who were in disagreement with the outcome of the election. You have a lot of those folks that were in alignment politically with that same outcome. And you're not going to get the change you need until your question, Chuck, is what is the role, and is there a role? And once you figure that out and where they're supposed to serve, then you can ask the question, if and who should be here. And we're not there yet. We just simply aren't there.
Yeah. I would point people to Chuck. I believe you had an op-ed in the Boston Globe asking that very question about who wants to be, a police officer, in addition to who should be. I wonder, and before I come back to you all, I just want to remind everybody that's watching that we are going to be taking audience questions here in a few minutes. And so if you do have audience questions, please submit them, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible here in just a few minutes. But yeah, I mean, Tracie in raising the question, who should be doing the policing, who should be doing the public safety as we, start to reimagine what our criminal justice system can look like. And the idea that policing has been too white and too male for too long, right? And so, what, in terms of, policing that is more reflective of the communities that they are supposed to be protecting and serving, what does that look like? Tracie, you talked a little bit earlier about, officers of color, women officers, and what they bring to the role. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. And then I want to come to Dwayne and you, Khalil, too, for your thoughts on who should be doing the policing and who we should be thinking about that we're not thinking about, to Dwayne's point, so that more folks can get, if not into Quantico, into, how do they get into the force in their communities?
I mean, so each group brings their own type of, perspective, lived experience, and culture. But you also have to remember, though, that that's not necessarily the fix either, because we know that Black officers as well can be equally as detrimental in excessive use of force on their own community.
Right.
So we have to be very careful about saying that this is going to be the solve for that.
Exactly.
And we also know, as we diversify our departments, as we diversify even more, it becomes problematic, and the culture issues they show even more. There's even more stress upon it when you add it. So, just an example, with my time with NYPD and over the academy, one of the discussions we had is like, why don't we have a class that is like 40 to 50% women? And you would have thought I said, let's burn the building down, because of those narratives and those things that come with being an officer, whether you're an officer of color or woman. So I have to tell you too, even in the work, we also show those folks leaving the job much sooner. They don't make it to retirement. Some of them don't. They just go, this isn't it. It's too much for me. It's too much of a stress on me and my family. I'm out. So that's the other thing we have to talk about. But I would say there's also community examples of community providing its own public safety. And we, for some reason, don't want to tap into that because it doesn't fit the narratives that we currently have. And frankly, it scares other people.
Yes.
But we have examples of going into communities and having that money there in community hubs and places where you can go if you need help or if you need something. So, I mean, I think it's nice to think about diversifying departments and have them reflect community, but even that has not given us the change that we thought we were going to get by doing. And this is not a new notion, right? I came under a consent decree. That's how I got my job. Someone had to sue, 2 women had to sue to get on, and then I had to come in behind them to get on. And so those lawsuits continue. So I don't necessarily think that's the answer either. I think we have to really talk about what is the role and how we define public safety. And do you need armed police for everything? And I think those are sort of the questions for me. So,
yeah, Khalil, I'll come to you, and then Dwayne, I'm gonna let you have the last word here before we open it up for questions.
So if the question is who should do the policing, I think that's the wrong question. The question is, what do we want the police to do, if anything? And that's most certainly the question that a lot of people at the community level, many of whom are Black and queer and trans and low income, but not exclusively, because this question is being raised in many different communities with many different people weighing in on it. That is the right question, because the culture of policing is so toxic, as we've said many times today, that it doesn't matter who you are. You can't beat it. Again, I've heard dozens of people say, I went into law enforcement or I went into the prosecutor's office because I believed that as a good person, I could make a difference. And they've all run for the hills. It's not gonna cut it. So I think the right question and the right answer should be, put the checklist together, look at the alternative systems, many of which themselves are punitive, and I don't want to overstate that our direct service, child welfare, even our public health systems are prepared to treat people with the dignity they deserve, but most of them are not armed.
Right.
And so at least we can have a conversation about people living to make a case for the justice they deserve when they are met with indignity. So that to me, and we could go on for a long time and map that, into these systems, but there are versions of this that already exist in overwhelmingly white places like Eugene, Oregon, and Seattle, where essentially, particularly around drugs, there's crisis workers where the call that comes into 911 is directed to essentially social workers of a kind and drug counselors, and they do the work, and the police never show up. And it's not an accident, I think, that that's happening and being experimented in these white communities. There's also the work of organizations like the Anti-Police Terror Project out of Oakland, which is systematically looking at the budget and saying, this is a moral document that tells us that the policing is the most important thing to the population of police elected officials and those who are carrying the power base of that community, when you have police officers who are making $200,000 in overtime on top of their salary to do everything, right? So these are social workers with guns in the tradition of expanding the police service. So when we are really thinking about what comes next, we ought to be thinking about all the things police officers don't do well. The last point, because this hasn't been said in this conversation and we have an audience listening, so I just thought we'd just make this point. 10.5 million arrests annually, 5% for things that amount to violent crimes. So for every police officer that you hear say, the purge is going to happen in your neighborhood if I'm not here to do this work, they're lying. Because even if they were there, they almost never prevent the harm that's happening, and they do a very bad job of catching the person who committed the harm. So it's like, it's a smokescreen. It's remarkable. So we have to think about policing as a massive jobs program. A massive jobs program, and a massive jobs program for white ethnic men who first, second, third generation have been able to secure a foothold in American society. And it's being extended, right, to first generation men of color from Caribbean countries, from African countries, from Asian countries, and some African Americans. It's still a jobs program. And if we can see it for what it is, then we can think about redistributing jobs and economic opportunity to other kinds of work that are much more dignified and pro-social and give the community the accountability they deserve.
Yeah, no, I think that last point was like extremely important. Just think about what it is that police officers do and to ask serious questions about why is it that that's the work that they do, and why don't they like do other work, and why don't we interrogate what people are actually getting arrested for, and more importantly, what people are getting accosted for that they never actually get arrested for. They get pulled over, they get pressed out on the street, and then they get let go. But the thing I wanted to say is also something that we haven't talked about today. We talk about what police do, we talk about who police are, but we don't talk about the way in which we encourage police to consume culture. I was thinking about this George Saunders story called Isabel. It's a fantastic story. It's like 8 pages long. This cop kills this kid. His, as frequently happens, his partner says nothing. And Saunders makes the cop sympathetic. The cop has a differently able child, and you see that the cop loves this kid. But this cop murdered the kid essentially for nothing. Kid had a little brother. Little brother's broken, right? Little brother can't get himself right. Years later, little brother runs up on the cop, basically hunts him down and has a pistol and is ready to murder the cop. And then the little brother turns the pistol on himself and kills himself. And I think, we talk about George Floyd, and we talk about all of these instances where people have been killed by the cop, as if like the murder hasn't left a lasting legacy on the family and the community. And when we consume the George Floyd trial, we don't know anything about the family. We don't know anything about the neighborhood. The trial becomes like watching Jeopardy. I mean, literally, you watch it and you holding your breath, hoping that the verdict is guilty because you don't want to deal with what it means that the verdict is not guilty. And it's been the same thing for all of those cases. And my question is always, how do judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and most importantly, police officers understand the communities where they work? Why is it okay to be illiterate and come into a community and have the most absurd views about who makes up that community. Because the one thing that's clear, I would give you $20. If you like was accused of stealing $20 worth of goods from the store, and it's three of us and we're in charge of policing the community. Look, you know what, Mr. Floyd, we gave him the $20. We're just trying to figure out what's going on. I don't even understand, like, fundamentally how $20 matters that much. And all of the questions we're asking, we aren't asking what profoundly happened to, like, this police department where this guy was he wasn't even willing to contemplate that he was giving away his life for $20. He worse than me because he got 19 years on the police force. When I robbed that man for $10, every adult in Fairfax County, Virginia wanted me to go to prison. The prosecutor said I should get life in prison. The police officer said, I hope you make better decisions later on. And yet this cop with 19 years on the force was willing to, like, put his knee on somebody's neck for 9 minutes for $20. And nobody's asking what's fundamentally wrong with a police force that, like, has done nothing at all to make its officers find that is not absurd, but is literally obscene. And we could say that it's because the officers aren't encouraged by their supervisors to step in. Except if we say that, we don't have a police force. We have, like, I don't even know what you call it. We have a standing army that has, like, it sounds like I'm reading Primo Levi and he's talking about the Holocaust. And it sounds like what happens when men are allowed to believe that anything matters for the sake of what somebody else said, not even for the sake of what they believe in. Because those other cops who was there clearly don't believe that George Floyd deserved to be murdered. And so I ask myself, not just how training is going, but like, what obligation do we have? You know, I remember a big television company, movie theater. They called us in to view this movie before it came out because they were concerned about how the movie might inflame the public. How is it that, like, nobody's concerned with how the lack of like visual representation literature is causing the police force to just believe you're just running around in the world acting like anything is okay? And I just fundamentally find that completely disturbing. Again, noting that Chauvin is likely to spend less years in prison than I did for just flashing a pistol on somebody and taking $10. And at 16, I should have known it was wrong, but it is no way at 40 years old I'm gonna take, $10 from somebody. But Chauvin thought it was okay to hold his knee on somebody's neck for 20. And like, nobody has said fundamentally how absurd it is that we imagine that's like a legitimate form of policing.
Yeah, or that there was some other reasonable explanation for what we saw in the almost 10 minutes. So obviously all of you are helping to make me smarter, but and hopefully the people who are watching, but I want to take it now to some of the audience questions because there are some good ones that people have sent in and I want to try to get to as many of these as possible. So Dwayne, you just brought up sentencing. Obviously we've got about 8 weeks before Derek Chauvin will be sentenced. We've seen other cases, the rare cases where you have officers being convicted, but then the sentence does not necessarily feel commensurate, for a lot of members of the public with the crime that they are convicted of and the fact that, somebody's life was taken. I wonder if anybody wants to speak to the issue of how sentencing fits into the bigger picture. That is the question that is being asked.
Well, I do think we have to treat first-time offenders, even second-time offenders, differently. I think I've met with a number of prosecutors who are trying to change how they think about these issues, and I totally get that it's really important. And Dwayne was talking about jobs and so forth, and how difficult it is when someone has a record. for them to get a job. And we want, so I do believe that, we have to do better at the front end of this. But I also have to say that there are places in society, in communities, where if people commit violent crimes, we have to hold them accountable too. And one of the things that's going on right now in many cities across the country, in some of the poorest neighborhoods, is skyrocketing homicide rates and shootings. And there's victims there and there's perpetrators there. And we have an obligation. I mean, that's one of the things the police, we expect them to do, is to get in front of that next shooting. And they need community support to solve those crimes, to tell them who are the dangerous people. And if you go to Minneapolis now, you go in the 4th precinct or the 3rd precinct, they will tell you they need good, humane police, because absent that, they have a serious issue. The defund movement in Minneapolis suddenly became not an issue because people in those communities were saying, whoa, we need good, humane police. And that's happening around the country right now. And I do think that has to be part of this conversation is, how do we protect everybody, treat everybody humanely? Don't make a mistake and arrest someone for marijuana or something like that, or all of those things. But there is a concern that that part of this equation needs to be discussed, and not discussed in a negative way, but discussed in a way that says, should that be part of the discussion? How do we get people jobs? How do we do things for people so they don't commit crimes? But when people commit violent crimes like that, what do we do about that? I don't think that's an unfair question as we try to recognize we need humane police. If the police don't do their job in some areas of the city, things are going to get worse.
Can I respond?
I was like, Khalil, I saw you shifting in your seat there. I was going to come to you. Absolutely.
Yeah. So best I know, that the National Academies has not been able to attribute with any clarity, and or the range of social scientists have looked at these questions about the relationship of policing to reductions in violence. The best that we can say is that a number of factors, without giving primacy to any one particular one. So, cultural responses to the drug epidemic of crack by younger people decided not to do it. The presence of nonprofits in communities, the increasing relationship of the economy and opportunities in the 1990s and before the tech bubble in 2000. So it is another make-believe narrative of police that they are the instrument that delivers public safety to communities that are experiencing tremendous harm. What we do know actually works when we can isolate it are communities that have strong support for fellow community members to be activated as violence interrupters, to work inside those communities to prevent conflict from happening. And there's a lot of models of this, but mostly for the purposes of this discussion, every model diminishes the relationship of police to that work and enhances the role of the community in having the resources and the authority to do that work. Because the last thing you want are violence interrupters who often are themselves people who have justice involvement to be in harm's way, because when police officers show up, they too often shoot first and ask questions later. So what we see after Floyd is a combination of people responding to the pandemic out of doors in a time of heightened anxiety about the economic insecurities that they've been facing. And you can track the explosion of people on the streets to the explosion of violence that came with it. So I just want to say there is no longitudinal nor social scientific evidence to support Chuck's claim that police officers are the instrument of delivering safety to those communities. I'm going to concede to you that since no one can isolate this relationship, perhaps there is some role for them to play. But you suggest that they are the instrument of delivering that public safety, and that is a mischaracterization. And it is the argument that puts elderly people in their communities in the clutches of the community policing outreach intervention specialists, who are then saying, you know, Miss Johnson, this time things are going to be different. This time we're not going to stop your grandson on his way to school because he's 12 wearing a white t-shirt and a backpack, because, you know, all this stopping and frisk that we've been doing in the name of violence prevention turn out to be a massive project of racial control and abuse. So we're not even having a conversation about the microaggressions, the physical assaults, the brutalities that don't lead to dead bodies in the street. That's what the pattern and practice investigations reveal. So please, let's not go backwards with regard to saying that police officers who clear about 40% of homicides in most cities, right? They don't even find the people who get it, and to then blame Black people because they're not cooperating for the police. It's just a self-fulfilling cycle of self-congratulation for what the police officers do.
But you know, the other thing that's really troubling though is this question was about the sentencing of Officer Chauvin, ex-Officer Chauvin, and the conversation quickly turned to violence in Black communities as opposed to what should happen at this sentencing. And I think that's the switcheroo, right? It's like the bait and switch. We are supposed to be answering a question about what punishment is warranted for Chauvin for murdering George Floyd. And instead, we're talking about the ways in which police insert themselves as the like maintainer of safety and communities. And like, as you clearly pointed out, they aren't even doing that. But I think it's important to just note that the real issue is, you say, how do we address violence and how do we hold people like accountable and punish people? When police commit violence, they are never punished. And this conversation, like, we can have the other conversation later, right? This conversation is fundamentally about the fact that Chauvin will not be treated in the same way that anybody in a Black or brown community is treated when they get picked up and accused even of robbery. And I think it's just strange to like dance around that question, because that is what we'll be dealing with when Chauvin gets sentenced. And that's what we dealt with every time a police officer gets convicted and then gets convicted of some unintentional homicide and gets 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. And everybody has a cousin that got 20 for marijuana.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your point, Dwayne, and I appreciate everybody's perspective there. But to your point, Dwayne, that was sentencing was the issue that the questioner was asking about. And I want to move on to some more questions because we got a lot that people want people to respond to. We talked about January 6th, the insurrectionists. What work is being done to root out white supremacists from police forces? Tracie, maybe you want to start with this one.
Well, first of all, there's got to be an acknowledgement that it exists, and that you have those folks amongst your ranks. And so there's a number of things that some chiefs are doing, not all, and trying to make sure that they do social media checks, that they do a little bit more, I think, on who do you have here, clearances when you want to make sure people don't have warrants, and looking at tattoos. And those are things we used to do historically, right? So who's coming in, who's coming here. But it goes back to who do you have amongst your ranks? What is the conversation that is happening, and what are they talking about? And for the street officers who have just endured the last, 2-3 years in the last administration, where it was very blatant that you could say what you want to say and nothing was going to happen to you. So there's a number of things that I think chiefs are trying to do, but I can tell you that there has been an emboldenment of folks from the last 4 years who think that they don't have to adhere, or, this is not a thing for them. So there's, ways in which they can go in and make sure that they have, do a security check again, run them through. Usually when you come out of the department, unless you get arrested, they don't do a background, they don't check anything else until something happens to you. So periodically try to step up and do those things as well. But really making sure that you're paying attention to what people are doing and saying on social media. That doesn't mean you're going to get at it, because as we all know, things get pushed underground. What you saw on January 6th was not supposed to be on plain view that way. That's why officers were there, firefighters were there, doctors were there. And so the question is bigger than what is the police department going to do? This is it's a culture issue for all of us, probably in every aspect in which we live. Those are some of the things that, they're trying to do. But again, it goes back to what is it, and who is it you have, in your organization.
Yeah. I'm going to bring this next one to you, Khalil, because you were talking a little bit about this, and I think somebody is following up on this in their question. This is about the idea of communities taking on public safety, for themselves. Can you give some ideas on how to reform the system at a community level, or what the best ways are to work towards this change as someone who does not work in this system?
So I'll give a very precise answer to this question. Look, we want to shift the primary relationship of conflict and conflict resolution in communities to the public health sector. And we want to give them the authority to define what does a healthy community look like and how to measure that. The reason I say that is because we're putting public health inside of policing in a lot of places as they begin to experiment, which again is just extending the reach of police. But we know they don't have the culture nor the training or the capacity at this time. Maybe in a future world that can happen. But in the meantime, if we give public health authority to define the relationship of community workers, to hire them, to give them the training that they need. These are people who, by definition, want to be safe in their communities. And at the same time, they have no incentive to shoot people because they're afraid of them. I mean, that is not the case. Now, there's retaliation. There's all kinds of things that happen to people who have beef with each other. A lot of beef that often derives from the fact that there's a lot of scarcity in their communities. So we can't keep having a conversation that is solving for safety without having a conversation that recognizes scarcity. Mm-hmm. And that is part of what it means to have a public health conversation, because then we're talking about food deserts, we're talking about poor living conditions, we're talking about poisonous lead and water, we're talking about everything that matters in a community and its infrastructure, and how to make that community as healthy and prosperous as possible.
I'm going to come to you, Dwayne. This person is asking if you could make one change, big or small, to the justice system, what would it be?
I think we've had a long time with police having guns, and I would say, how about let's take guns away from police? Frankly, just take guns out of the hands of police, and you could do your job of policing without a gun. You could not accidentally pick up your gun instead of the taser, because all you have is a taser. Actually, I'll take two. I know they say ask for one, but I'll take two. So one is take guns out of the hands of police. And two is to institute a draft in which 10, 15, 20% of the community had to cycle into the police force, serving 3 years to 5 years, and it'll be paid employment. And maybe after that time, they get a partial pension. But you got to create a workforce that is far more porous than it is right now, because the blue wall of silence only exists if it's a blue wall. If you imagine some subset of the community within that community, that would be a jobs program. It'd be a more attainable jobs program. You wouldn't be giving people guns. You'd be having them working in the community. So I would say those two things. You find a way to make some subset of the population in a community have to work for the police department for 10 to 15, for like 10, 15, 20%. For 3 to 5 years. And in fact, if you just open it up, people would apply. If it wasn't a lifetime commitment, you do that, you take guns out of the hands of the police. I think those are two interventions that would change the landscape.
Okay, one more, and this one is for everybody. Okay, so wake up tomorrow, you get a call from the White House. President Biden wants to talk to you to hear your ideas about policing. What advice would you give the president on these issues about what kind of role the federal government should be playing? Chuck?
I would say you've got Camp David. You bring Middle East people together at Camp David. Bring some community people and police chiefs together and have them sit down for a weekend and just listen to each other. I want to correct something Professor Muhammad said, the notion that I am advocating the police can somehow by themselves impact violent crime in communities. It's not what I said at all. I believe that police would be completely unsuccessful if they try to do that themselves. Violence interrupters work with the police. I've worked with them in Chicago. I've worked with them all over. There's no way either of those groups can succeed without each other. So I really needed to correct that, because that's a total mischaracterization of what we want the police to do. The police will be totally unsuccessful if they don't have the support of the community. And right now, that's the number one issue for police chiefs, is how do we build community support? Thank you.
Khalil, do you want to say what you would say to President Biden if you were to go to the White House tomorrow?
Yeah, I would tell him that if he had a massive gun confiscation program, then we'd all live in a healthier America. This does go along with Dwayne Betts. I mean, it's kind of like the conservatives who say critical race theory is killing America. Like the very thing that actually helps make possible understanding how this society works. Like, I'm not afraid of that, but I'm also not afraid of gun confiscation. And so we need to have politicians who believe that we have too many guns in American society and start taking some of them away from people, if not all of them. And then Dwayne's idea can be put in effect. And then, we've just got a bunch of people who are much more likely to live in the midst of an encounter. And as crazy as that sounds, that is a solution. Yeah. And so whether or not we have the ability to do that. And so note that the Supreme Court in the Heller case, as well as in the McDonald case, basically interpreted a comma to mean that everybody can have a gun, is just how random. We started this conversation about jurors. Well, those were justices. It's just how random it is that we can live in a society where there are more guns than people. And Biden needs to have a serious conversation with this nation, and the political elite need to have a serious conversation, particularly those that are now Democrats. Whatever they might be in 25 years is up for debate. But whatever they are now, to solving this problem, because this is not going to go away. It just is just a race to the bottom. And eventually those guns are going to be coming to more and more white communities, because as scarcity increases across this landscape, guns will be a solution for people to solve these problems.
Mm. Tracie, what about you? What would you say to President Biden?
Well, I would question why he was calling me, first of all, because I don't think that that's reality. So what I would actually say just that, why are you calling me? You don't need Camp David. What you need to do is go to the ground, go where the people are dying, go to the communities who are doing this work and talk to them. Listen to their stories, listen to their experiences, and learn, because that's what's happening now. And it's, what Khalil just said about, how do you remove the guns out of this space? And that's what the work Ithaca is doing. Ithaca is doing just that. We don't want guns here. We need a completely different way to do this. It includes community and community providing that service. So that would be me. It's like, I don't know how you got my number. I probably could guess. But it's one of those things is, you're talking to the wrong person. You need to go on the ground where the work is happening and talk to the people who have survived it and are doing it and are trying to do something different.
Yeah. Dwayne, what about you? You're going to the White House tomorrow. What do you tell President Biden?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that's been said. And the one thing I would say is that going back to the Wright novel, it's a way in which policing is really intertwined with our system of punishment. I mean, police are taught to believe that the criminal suspect is not worthy of respect or dignity, because our system treats the criminal defendant as being a person that's not worthy of respect or dignity. And I would say that the one thing the White House can do is rhetorically lead the push. It's this tension between wanting to convict Chauvin and to have prison be a punishment and wanting to address mass incarceration. And we try to cabin those two discussions. And I would say that the White House could be a leader on arguing about what is a just punishment and what is the way to see people who have been convicted of crimes, because it's like far too often. Why are we locking somebody up for a fake $20 bill, allegedly? Why are we pulling somebody over because of a minor traffic violation? And how come the police officers don't have the imagination to do something different? Well, why should they? When they look at the laws on record, and the law suggests that you could get 5 years for this fake $20 bill. And that 5 years communicates the kind of seriousness that nobody believes should be the case. And so I would say that the White House could lead the push to reevaluate what we mean when we say what is permissible to do to citizens when they have committed a criminal offense.
Errin, I just got to add one tiny thing, because this is such a point that Dwayne is making. And think about all of the malfeasance and criminality committed by Wells Fargo, who put accounts on people, which cost them fees, bad credit, and no police show up. That's just a tiny example. So if we're going to talk about $20 and forgery and the notion of so-called white collar criminality, we have a justice system that simply allows the financial sector to rob people every single day. Some of it is actually illegal. A lot of it is actually legal. And very few, if nobody, gets arrested, let alone a knee on the neck. I mean, it is absolutely absurd. It is absolutely absurd. And so we just, are we just overwhelmed with the enormity of it all, that we can't do anything about it, and we just go for like beating up on the littlest people in the society, right? Because that's what it feels like.
Yeah. You certainly get the last word, because I think that is a strong note to end on. This was a fascinating conversation, very powerful, and I appreciate every one of your perspectives so much. Thank you so much to everybody who tuned in and for your very thoughtful questions as well. We have run out of time, unfortunately, because this was so robust and everybody had such great perspectives. But Chuck, Khalil, Dwayne, and Tracie, thank you so much for this conversation tonight, and for allowing me to help kind of facilitate it. But everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Take care, stay safe, and have a good night.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.